I'm Jeremiah Piper, and you're listening to Science from the Source. In today's episode, we talk neuroscience, Parkinson's disease, and transcranial magnetic stimulation, as I speak with Brittany Rurak, who is a Ph.D. candidate in the Action and Cognition Group within the School of Psychology and Exercise Science at Murdoch University. In this interview, Brittany discusses her Ph.D. characterizing associations between cortico-cortical connectivity and tremor in Parkinson's disease. And then she outlines her recent findings from her paper, Test-Retest Reliability of Cortico-Cortical Connectivity in Younger and Older Adults, which she will be presenting at the Western Australia Neuroscience Conference in November. Brittany, thanks for coming on the show.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
No problem. You are a PhD candidate in the School of Psychology and Exercise Science at Murdoch University. Mm-hmm. And today we're going to talk about your thesis, which is titled Characterizing Associations Between Cortico-Cortical Connectivity and Tremor in Parkinson's Disease. And then we're going to be talking a lot about your abstract, which you submitted and been an invited speaker to the Western Australia Neuroscience Conference in November. Which is titled Test-Retest Reliability of Cortico-Cortical Connectivity in Younger and Older Adults. So before we get started with that, again, you are a PhD student within this school, so I think most people here know you quite well. I see you around quite often.
Yeah.
But for people who don't know you and don't know your journey to a PhD, if you wouldn't mind just kind of talking about how you got to this point, what drove you from your undergrad to want to do something that's going to take 3 years of your life, and what you maybe hope to do once you're done.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I have to stem back to what my personal goals were originally, which inspired me to do my undergrad, and consequently led me to my PhD. So reflecting back, I suppose my story is a little bit unlike most people. I remember the exact moment when I wanted to do an undergrad degree. And it was when I was sleeping in a cupboard because I don't really have one of those standard environments that everyone gets to develop in. But I recall thinking when I was in this cupboard, thinking about how I can change my lifestyle and how can I get away from conforming to this type of environment. What can I do? And the only answer I could come up with is intelligence. That's the only way I can change my lifestyle. So from that point forward, I was very motivated to do well in high school. And during high school, that's when I started to think about what am I interested in? What do I want to study in university? And I knew I was interested in the well-being and mental health of others. And I also knew I was interested in investigating alcohol and drug dependency behavior. So it was quite easy for me to identify what I wanted to study, which was psychology. And psychology is very multidisciplinary, so I knew I would be able to address different interests. So from there, I applied and I did my undergrad in psychology. And I selected units to help me develop skills to better address my interests, my personal interests of mental health and drug dependency and alcohol behavior. However, it eventually evolved into an interest in neurophysiology and behavior. And I was largely exposed to understanding the underpinnings of brain function and movement when I did a research unit. It kind of went from that point forward. I did a little bit of research under Dr. Anne-Marie Valence's mentorship. Or mentoring?
Mentorship?
Mentorship? Yes. And she really inspired me to continue with research. So that's when I applied for my honors to pursue age-related neurophysiological changes relative to behavior.
So you started off kind of thinking that you wanted to work in psychology,
Yes.
more drug dependence, and then you kind of shifted to a neurophysiology, neuroscience
Yes,
stint.
you will.
What is it about research that intrigues you? So, I mean, you could go off and you could be a clinician, you could be a researcher. You can always be both, but what kind of pushes you more in that direction?
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm really interested in formulating hypotheses and testing these hypotheses. It very much excites me to learn more about the outcome. So I suppose I'm really indulging in my analytical and critical thinking at the moment. But I'm very aware that research is very important in clinical practice or from a practitioner's point of view. I will eventually do clinical psychology, but at the moment I find it very important to establish the skills for rigorous research.
But then do you see that your area of research is something that you could bring into clinical practice, or is it more on the theory side, or is it something that you see that you might be able to apply straight into some type of clinical? Yeah,
so several of my research questions are clinically relevant. For example, I will largely be investigating mood disorders within individuals with Parkinson's disease and how that's associated with tremor. Missing from the literature is the investigation of non-motor symptoms. It's very limited. So everyone is heavily focused on the motor symptoms, which are motor dysfunctions that can be observed. So I hope that from my research, I would be able to extend more into the non-motor symptoms and pair it with the non-motor symptoms. So it's clinically relevant in that aspect. And the third study acts as an intervention, and hopefully we find that it does have some implications with tremor. However, that one is largely theory-driven. But if it does have a significant effect, then it is, again, clinically relevant.
Okay. Well, that's a great segue into the actual next part of the interview where we'll talk about your PhD in general. So this part of the interview, we really want to look at your PhD as a whole. Mm-hmm. What is you're hoping to achieve? And you mentioned that you're working with, you're interested more in the mood disorders and not so much the movement disorders. And the population, at least from your title, is that you're focusing on people with Parkinson's disease. Yeah. A couple things before we even get started. So you mentioned motor symptoms, and so when you're going through your description of your thesis, if you wouldn't mind talking about maybe specifically what kind of mood disorders, what kind of movement disorders, what are they, and how they might manifest in someone who has Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, so I should clarify a little bit. So the mood disorders or the non-motor symptoms is more so a personal interest and a secondary outcome of the entire thesis. The primary outcome is tremor, and that's what we're largely interested in. We only recently included the non-motor symptoms because I keep identifying this gap in the literature. However, yes, it is largely about tremor. So what we're trying to investigate is what's underpinning tremor. So 90% of individuals with Parkinson's disease have tremor, and there's different types of tremor. So you can have resting tremor, which is a tremor that can be identified when the arm is resting on the arm of the chair or on your lap. Or there's postural tremor, which is when your arm's extended in the air and the tremor will be very active. And then thirdly, there's active tremor. So if you asked an individual with Parkinson's disease to touch their nose, they would have a very difficult time smoothly executing that movement due to the tremor. For the current study, we're only going to be investigating resting and postural tremor just because they're the more common tremors identified in individuals with Parkinson's disease.
And do those tremors increase in severity as the disease progresses? So is it something? Yeah. So when you're looking at clients or patients or participants who are coming to do your research, is it important that you select them somewhere on the spectrum, or can you? Yeah. Is your work looking at anywhere from early, maybe early onset is what you call it, to late progression? Yeah,
so it depends on the tremor type. So, for example, resting tremor has a frequency, and it doesn't typically progressively get worse, but it's just maintained, so within 4 to 9 hertz. Whereas postural tremor is similar. Doesn't necessarily progress in severity, but it does have a certain frequency it stays at.
For people who don't know anybody with Parkinson's disease, I think it's fairly it's fairly well publicized, the impact. But what type of impact do these tremors have on those individuals? So I know your work's quite important, and so my question is, if you're able to affect the tremor and you can somehow either alleviate or just or delay onset, what kind of impact do you think that would have on individuals' lives?
So it'd be predominantly on their everyday activities. So simple things that we take for granted, such as tying your shoes or buttoning up a shirt, would be a very difficult task for individuals with Parkinson's disease and tremor. So we hope that we can reduce or alleviate their tremor symptoms to help facilitate those what we deem easy tasks. As a consequence of having a severe tremor, individuals often need a caregiver or caretaker, I should say. And this could really jeopardize the independence of individuals with Parkinson's disease. And this can also impact their non-motor symptoms and evoke depressive symptoms or anxiety because they're no longer able to do these tasks independently.
Was there a reason why you chose this disease? So there are other neurological disorders that have movement impairments or issues with just motor function. Yes. Why did you choose Parkinson's disease as your focus? Yeah, so I suppose I can attribute it to my undergrad degree, the exposure we received about Parkinson's disease, and it just triggered a interest in me. So I don't have anyone within the scope of my family or friends that have Parkinson's disease. It was just, I suppose, self-initiated interest into the disease. But yeah, I suppose also from doing a little bit of research in movement, it allowed me to think about all the different movement disorders, and I just kept going back to people with Parkinson's. What do you hope to achieve with your research then? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, and you finish your thesis, what do you hope to have added to the knowledge, or do you think that your research is going to have a significant impact right away on those people suffering from Parkinson's disease? Yeah, that would be optimistic to say that it will be effective. But the ultimate goal is to identify treatments, interventions, or optimal protocols that we can use that hopefully can enhance our knowledge about brain function in individuals with Parkinson's disease. And I guess in hope of it effectively reduces tremor, but again, that's quite optimistic of me to think. That's all right. It's the reason I asked that is that my team works with Alzheimer's disease, and again, a neurodegenerative disease, and so one of your goals is to hopefully understand better how the brain interacts with the disease itself. What do we know currently about that? And for a lot of diseases, we don't know a lot because we don't really know how the brain works. So what do we currently know about Parkinson's disease and brain interaction or connectivity? Yeah, so a lot of the literature is focused on neuroimaging. So what we know about the brain is from neuroimaging studies. However, it's been well established that the primary brain area that is jeopardized is called the basal ganglia.
Specifically, there's a neurotransmitter which is referred to as dopamine. So dopamine is important for initiating smooth voluntary movement. So this dopamine is reduced in individuals with Parkinson's disease, and as a consequence, we see motor dysfunctions. So again, from neuroimaging studies, we have learned that there's other brain regions, specifically motor brain regions, that have deficits or too much activity or not enough activity. However, neuroimaging only gives us so much information. It's not telling us exactly what the neurons are doing. So using the tools that we use, referred as non-invasive brain stimulation, we're able to better understand how different neurons communicate across different motor brain regions.
You're saying that certain areas can be too excited or too little excited. So does that mean that our brain works really on a kind of a fine area for, if you want to say optimal, it works optimally in a really fine area. So if it's too active, it's not good. If it's not active enough, it's not good.
Yeah. So I'll give examples of different motor brain regions, and these are the brain regions that I'm targeting within my PhD study. So the first one is called the supplementary motor area, and this brain region is important for self-initiated movement. So what we've learned from neuroimaging studies is that this brain region has less activity. And we believe as a consequence of having less activity, this is impacting self-initiated movement seen in people with Parkinson's disease. And then there's another area called the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is important for balance and coordinating and regulating movement. And in people with Parkinson's disease, this area has an increase in activity. And we believe that this increase in activity is attributing to tremor in people with Parkinson's. So there's not a lot of studies deeming these associations. However, that's what we're looking to find out, whether an increase or a decrease in neural activity is a product of tremor.
Just for people like me who have no idea what we're talking about, so can you give me an example of what would be a self-initiated activity? So you're saying the supplemental motor cortex affects self-initiated. Is that just things like you're reaching for a glass of water, you're doing stuff like that? Okay,
yeah, exactly. So if you requested someone with Parkinson's disease to throw a ball, it might be difficult, or to grab a glass of water or what have you. Yeah.
And maybe there's no answer to this question, but what if those movements were reactions to something? So not self-initiated, but let's say I threw a ball at you and you go to catch the ball because it's going to hit you in the face or something.
Yeah.
Would that still be affected in this situation?
From my knowledge, it isn't. So they are able to react and catch the ball. It's more so when they have to initiate that movement themselves.
And dopamine is an important neurotransmitter in this disease state.
Yes.
So I know there's certain types of drugs that affect dopamine, and people might use drugs throughout their life. Is this one of the causes of Parkinson's disease, or do they think of some of the causes that drugs that affect dopamine levels might then affect Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, so it's well established within the literature that dopamine is driving Parkinson's disease. However, there's emerging evidence to suggest that perhaps it's other brain regions, for whatever reason, is also contributing. But it's likely a byproduct of the lack of dopamine. Okay. So, it's predominantly focused on dopamine from the scope of my knowledge. Okay. Yeah.
And then dopamine so for someone, again, who doesn't know anything about how the brain works, and again, I'll put myself in that category. So dopamine just helps with kind of the connections or the way that neurons talk to one another. Is that...
Yeah, exactly. It's just relaying good vitamins through the brain, if you will, loosely speaking. Yeah.
Okay, so you're then working with some techniques that you're hoping to stimulate or inhibit areas?
Yeah, so what we're looking to do, first we want to measure how different motor brain regions communicate with one another. So the brain regions that I spoke about earlier, the supplementary motor area and the cerebellum, we're interested in how those brain regions communicate with another one called the primary motor cortex, which is a brain region important for the execution of voluntary movement. So we'll first measure connectivity between these brain regions, and then what we hope to find is there might be a decrease or an increase in connectivity between these motor brain regions. And if this is the case, then we'll modulate connectivity by increasing or decreasing. So, for example, the cerebellum, as I said earlier, it has been shown by neuroimaging studies that there's an increase in activity. If we indeed find this using non-invasive brain stimulation, we hope to modulate that brain activity by decreasing it, and then we'll observe tremor and see if there's any differences.
Okay. So is that what is meant by cortico-cortical connectivity?
Yeah. So just the connectivity between different motor brain regions.
Okay. And so you're going to do something, and you kind of already alluded to the fact that you might be using non-invasive stimulus.
Yeah.
And that's TMS? Or
Yeah, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So it can be used to measure or modulate brain activity.
And we had a podcast a few months ago where we talked a bit about memories and how they're made and how TMS might affect that.
Okay.
But now you're trying to measure actual connectivity or changes, and I guess if someone was listening to this, they were going to wonder how, because you're talking about the brain, you're talking about a structure that largely is unknown how things work.
Yeah.
How are you actually measuring connectivity from place to place?
Yeah, so what we know about the brain is, and specifically about the primary motor cortex, is there's these underlying neurons which are called excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So to simplify, the excitatory neuron is what we can refer to as a on button. So it excites and activates activities. And then there's the inhibitory neurons, which I'll refer to as the off neurons. So it stops any movement, loosely speaking. So what we do, we have these different stimulation protocols that can preferentially activate inhibitory off and excitatory on processes.
So how then do you know that it's working? So if you, and I don't know, I've had TMS done to me a few times, and I know what it feels like, and it's you're sending an electromagnetic charge through the brain. Is that correct?
So you're administering a high electric pulse, which induces a magnetic field that passes through the skull and activates the underlying cortical tissue. So, for example, if I administer a single pulse TMS to the primary motor cortex, motor brain region, we can see or measure the effects of that stimulation by recording the response evoked in the contralateral muscle that we targeted. So the response evoked in the muscle is known as a twitch, but we refer and quantify it as a motor evoked potential, or MEP. Now, the size of the MEP, or the size of the twitch, is an indicator of how excitable these neurons are accordingly to the pathway.
So the MEP then that's recorded through some type of ability to measure electrical activity going into the muscle, but you can also see a movement, right?
Yeah.
So do you try to measure the movement itself?
Yeah, so we do measure the movement by applying electromyography, or EMG, which will record muscle activity.
So we're getting to the next part of the interview. I think that at this point we have a pretty good grasp of what it is you're attempting to do, and it's a pretty important area of research. And now you've done some research, and you've been asked to present that research. So you didn't just apply; you've been invited to speak at a conference to talk about the techniques that you're using and the reliability of those techniques.
Yeah.
Before we get into the actual paper, why is it important that your techniques are reliable, and what does that mean in terms of people using your research ideas elsewhere?
Yeah, so it's important to establish test-retest reliability of any measures, particularly if you're applying into a clinical population, because you want to be confident that you are measuring what you indeed set out to measure. And what was the second part of the question?
I'm just wondering how, I think you're answering it. The point was, you're looking at reliability, and that's an important part of measurements. Mm-hmm. Why was that so important then in terms of other people using your techniques?
Yeah, it was actually more important because there's a discrepancy within the literature about what is the optimal stimulation protocol to use to measure connectivity. So everyone, well, not everyone, but some protocols use different stimulation parameters or different intervals between the pulses being administered. They can even change the coil types or orientation applied to the head. So we really wanted to draw on all of the current stimulation protocols to first have a comprehensive understanding of which protocol is effective in measuring connectivity, and then also to identify whether it is a reliable measure.
So if you're trying to stimulate a certain area, I'm assuming there's pretty well defined areas that you stimulate.
Yes.
And so you're using those already predefined areas?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then when you use an optimal stimulation protocol, you're more than likely to evoke the same magnitude of response. So we want to make sure that there's consistency. So if I were to apply a certain protocol and find that the magnitude of excitation is X amount, we want to be able to say, so if you applied this same protocol, the magnitude should be comparable, and so forth. So it's important that we trial different intervals between pulses to see if we can elicit different magnitudes or elicit a different response.
Okay, and in your study, you're using something called a paired pulse as opposed to a single pulse or repetitive TMS. What's the difference between single pulse, paired pulse, and repetitive TMS? Yeah,
so single pulse is, as the name implies, is just a one pulse, and it will activate the pathway from the brain to the muscle, also known cortical spinal excitability. Paired pulse TMS can preferentially activate inhibitory and excitatory processes acting within the primary motor cortex, and we do this by altering the TMS protocol. And then repetitive TMS is where you modulate brain activity by increasing or decreasing the activity.
Okay, so in a paired pulse, then you talked about on-off switches. So you're trying to turn things on and trying to turn things off with a paired pulse.
Yeah.
Okay, and so then in your paper or the abstract you're going to be presenting, you were looking at the duration between the paired pulses. Is that correct?
Yes.
And why is that important?
Yeah, so we've administered several different intervals. For one of the sites that we're interested in, we did it just because we wanted to see if there's any latency in the magnitude of facilitation or in the magnitude of connectivity. For the other paired pulse protocol, we have two different intervals, and one acts as a control interval and one acts as a interval that has been well established to evoke inhibitory processes acting in the cerebellum.
Again, I know nothing about this
I
stuff.
can see that in your face reaction.
So I have no idea what you're talking about. But so if you're doing paired pulse, is the duration of the between the two pulses, does that make a difference of whether you're inhibiting or activating something?
Yeah,
okay.
So that paired with the intensities we're using will evoke a different response. So, for example, if I was targeting the connectivity between cerebellum and the primary motor cortex, if I used an interval between the pulses of 5 milliseconds, you will consistently evoke inhibitory processes. Whereas if I administered an interval of 3 milliseconds between those two pulses, you will find that you're not evoking inhibitory processes, and it's more so normal activity, if you will. So you have to find those optimal intervals to evoke different responses.
Okay, so, and in your paper, though, and we're doing this a little bit different than other ones, because other ones I kind of just let people go on, but I think we've just talked into it, so it's working out. No, it's working out really quite nice. I enjoy this. So in your paper, you've used 5, 6, 7, and 8 milliseconds as your test durations, but you're just kind of discussing that 5 and downward. You said at 3, maybe you're not. So why 5, 6, 7, 8, and not 5, 4, 3, 2, 1? It
depends on the site you're targeting. So I should be more clear in that abstract. Thank you for pointing that out. So the 5 milliseconds is used for measuring connectivity between cerebellum and the primary motor cortex, whereas the 6, 7, 8 is used for the other motor brain regions, i.e. supplementary motor area and primary motor cortex. And we use 6, 7, 8 milliseconds for that protocol because it accurately, if you will, activates facilitatory or excitatory processes. Whereas if I used a interval of 2 or 3 milliseconds, it won't elicit that response.
In terms of stimulating the brain, and again, I always think of the fact that we don't really know what's going on in the brain sometimes, and everything seems to be quite well connected. And how do you know when you're stimulating an area that you're not just stimulating a whole bunch of other areas, and so what you're seeing, the outcome is really being driven by your intent, or that it's being driven by other alternative outcomes that you don't know are happening in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it often gets posed. So one way we know that we are targeting the correct site is by using different coil types. So some coil types are quite focal, and that means that we can target a specific area. But if we want to target beyond superficial layers, we have to use a different coil type, and there is a risk of it crossing over. However, the areas that we target are quite large in nature, so it's unlikely we are activating other brain regions, to say the least.
Okay, so your paper then, and we've talked already mostly about it, but your paper, it was looking at the idea of reliability of those measurements.
Yes.
And just through that quick conversation, we know now that you're stimulating areas that are common areas of stimulation. Those areas are quite large, so it's probably not a crosstalk going on between your stimulation and those areas. Probably not. And so your paper or your abstract is really about the test-retest reliability of the outcomes when you're changing the duration between the paired pulse.
Yeah, so that's just in healthy older and younger adults. And then we also added in some behavioral tasks just so we can learn about that population's neurophysiology and behavior.
Did you expect between the young and older adults you'd see differences?
Yeah, we expected it because connectivity between these areas have been tested before, some of them using different protocols, but particularly for the supplementary motor area and the primary motor cortex, because it's been conducted in our lab already, and they found a significant difference between the groups. So from memory, younger adults had greater connectivity between those brain regions, whereas older adults had less activity. And this was associated with some of the behavioral tasks.
Okay. And so maybe for the listeners, you can kind of walk us through the process that you took to then undertake the study. So we kind of already have a good background now. So what is it you actually did to achieve your desired outcome?
That's a tricky one. So the test-retest reliability was the last study selected. So I did a large literature review about what is known about the different brain areas and functions of them in people with Parkinson's disease. And that led me to a lot of neuroimaging studies to show where there's an increase or decrease of activity. From that, I noticed that there wasn't a lot of TMS studies being conducted to really understand those underlying processes. So that just evolved into measuring brain activity and identifying how that's associated with tremor, because there's not a lot known about how connectivity between motor brain regions is associated with tremor. And then as that idea typically goes, then we decided that we wanted to modulate the activity depending on the results of the second study.
Okay, so for this study, then again, you're looking kind of at the reliability. So you had people come in multiple times. We sent a pulse into their heads, a dual pulse, by the way. Yes. And you looked at the reliability of that from day to day, and the reliability you were measuring was the MEP outcome. Is that correct?
Yeah, evoked from the TMS protocol we were using.
And so, what did you find?
Yeah, so at the moment, because we are still we are still conducting the research, in older adults, but at the moment we have found that there is moderate to good test-retest reliability in younger adults for both sites that we're targeting. And we found the same in older adults. We found moderate and good reliability in both groups.
So in your abstract, you do mention that they occur at slightly different durations. So in the younger group, it's the reliability is decent at 5 milliseconds, and the older group is decent at 7 milliseconds. Why do you think that's the case?
So in younger adults, when we're targeting the upper motor brain regions, we found that there's high test-retest reliability using intervals of 6 and 7 milliseconds. And at the moment, we have found the same in older adults. And it's similar when we're targeting the lower brain region and the primary motor cortex. We have found test-retest reliability at the interval we suspected to find it at, and that was at 5 milliseconds. Okay. So it's matching or aligning with our hypotheses at the moment. Okay. So there was only one interval that we didn't find it at, and that was at 8 milliseconds. Which might suggest that is too long of an interval to sufficiently evoke that response consistently. And
so then from these outcomes, if I was a researcher, a neuroscientist, why would I think that's important? So what from what you've done, and I understand it's important, but why do you think it's important, and why should the scientific community, also feel it's an important outcome?
Yeah, because we're able to reliably measure facilitatory and inhibitory processes between the different motor brain regions. That's important for when we're trying to develop more refined interventions or treatments for targeting these brain regions. So it'll allow us to modulate that brain activity. So if we didn't find that reliability, that might suggest that we need to reinvestigate the TMS protocol that's being administered. But yeah. Okay.
And you did measure some actual movement tests, and so you used I think a get up and go test, and you had someone do a pegboard test. Yeah. And when we're talking about reliability, we're looking at MEP signals, so measured at the muscle that's being moved, and it's a small hand gesture that's you're measuring. Yeah. Have you been able to look at any of those other movement patterns yet and see what the influence your TMS had on that?
Yeah, so I've only reviewed it in the younger adults at the moment, given that I'm still collecting for the older adults. So at the moment, we have found a couple of associations between, it's a bit difficult because I'm finding which one to target. So the associations between the supplementary motor area and the primary motor cortex are with balance tasks, which isn't surprising because it has been demonstrated before. And we have also found that there's associations between the cerebellum and the primary motor cortex and gait behavior. And again, that wasn't a surprising finding given that associations have been demonstrated before.
Okay, so you've seen, you're able to confirm previous findings based on your data, but also now you've added the ability to suggest that the techniques themselves are reliable. And so you're able to measure from day to day what it is you think you're measuring. And the outcomes you're getting in terms of the actual movement patterns are confirming existing literature.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, that's an important finding. I mean, and I won't get to my take on things yet because I want to ask you two more questions before we finish because we're getting pretty close to time.
Okay.
So if you could sum up the outcome of the study, you can sum up this study just in general, and you could and I gave you 2 or 3 sentences to do it. All right, so you have 2 or 3 sentences to tell me. I'm a person on the street who just comes up to you, ask you what you've done. What would be those 2 or 3 sentences? How would you explain this entire study in 2 to 3 sentences?
So just study one or the entire PhD study?
No, just study one. So you can stick to just study one. So how would you explain that?
We've identified a measure of connectivity between different motor brain regions that can be demonstrated reliably. Did I say reliable?
You did.
How many times? Reliable.
Well, that's an important part. It's reliable. You were reliable. Everything's reliable.
And doing it in layman's terms. So we have identified a TMS protocol or a non-invasive brain stimulation protocol that is reliable in measuring how different motor brain regions communicate.
That's a great 2 sentence. That was fantastic. So that's good.
I was about to say reliable again.
Well, that's fine. It's subliminally placing it in people's minds. So the final question I ask, and this is the easiest question of the day.
I don't know.
If someone's listening to this and they're interested in what you're doing, right? Or there might be an interested participant. So maybe someone with Parkinson's disease wants to talk to you about your findings and how maybe TMS might be beneficial to them, or what they can do to help out. How would someone contact you? So this is the easiest question of the day. How would someone contact you if they wanted to get in touch with you about your research, being part of your research, or just even having a chat about what you're doing? So we do have a website that anyone can access. If they go to Murdoch University, they can just type in the search engine Action and Cognition, and that will list my current study as well as other studies that are being conducted in our lab. Beyond the website, is there another method that someone could directly contact you? So I can be contacted via email. So it's Brittany Rurak at murdoch.edu.au. I want to thank you for coming on the show today. Your work is, I think you're underselling a lot of the stuff that you're doing. I know that I think that your outcomes just in this study alone are quite important. I think they're developing techniques or establishing and solidifying techniques that are going to be able to be used by people in other research down the line that hopefully someday helps to either find a cure or a very good treatment for movement disorders. And so I really thank you for coming on, explaining that to us. I know it's a hard area to explain. You can see my face. I don't understand what you're talking about half the time, but I think you did a really nice job of giving an idea of how the brain is functioning in terms of movement patterns and then what it is that you're doing in general. So again, I thank you for coming on the show, and I hope you enjoyed the experience. Thank you. That concludes another episode of Science from the Source. If you enjoyed the podcast, please help support the show by telling your family and friends. If you would like to contact me to discuss the podcast or any of the content, please feel free to contact me via Twitter at Jeremiah Pfeiffer or by email at sciencefromthesource, that's all one word, @gmail.com.